In the Middle Ages, the fiddle or the vielle transitioned from an unknown, unattested entity in 10th century Europe to the most admired musical instrument by the end of the 13th century. While no physical evidence remains from this period, abundant literary and artistic evidence shows us that the metamorphosis of the vielle played a significant role in structures of music making and in the changes of these structures over time. In particular, this paper will focus on the change of attitude among the educated classes towards instrumentalists. With the rise of the courtly love aesthetic, we see the Boethian categories of poet versus musician blur and begin to break down because the troubadours composed both the poetry and melodies for their songs. In this paper, I suggest that the art of troubar is a pivotal artistic moment for instrumentalists as well. The social status of many of the troubadours, combined with the popularity of their music, contributed to the preservation of this repertory in manuscript form, and to the elevation of the vielle seen in the biographies of three troubadours who are remembered for playing it. I will use a blended methodology of musical, literary, and artistic analysis, along with actor network theory, to consider the extent to which the fiddle shaped the music and reputation of these three troubadours, and promoted the social standing of instrumentalists more broadly. The social construct known as the Three Estates is a useful place to begin because it describes medieval feudalism according to the structures that separated people by their skills. Both people and pastimes are further categorized by concepts of worth or virtue, which, along with reputation, are important themes embedded in troubadour song. The Three Estates, made up of oratores, those who pray, bellatores, those who fight, and laboratores, those who work. This hierarchical way of understanding society becomes muddied when one interrogates it according to a cultural production of the troubadours, since they fall into all three classes, as well as traverse between them. Actor network theory gives us a tool to see these categories interact and overlap, in addition to providing space for non-human actants like musical instruments. This methodology was developed by Michael Callan and Bruno Latour in the field of science and technology studies in order to map the relationships between material things and semiotic concepts. Ethnomusicologist Elliot Bates applies actor network theory to describe the, quote, social life of musical instruments, end quote, and explains how musical instruments can be understood as the site of activity involving multiple human and non-human actants, or people, things, and ideas. The first estate consisted of professional clergy, who were the gatekeepers and disseminators of knowledge in terms of book learning. The inheritance of Greek and Roman philosophy through the contemplations of Christian and Muslim writers infused medieval Europe with a profound appreciation for the power of music, flavored with a fervent disregard for the people who produced it. The late Roman philosopher Boethius demonstrates this clearly in two of the most frequently quoted passages from De Institutione Musica. The first concerns musical cosmology, which Boethius classifies into three categories: musica mundana, humana, and instrumentalis. This illumination illustrates the musical cosmology through the personification of music as a queen, pointing out each level. At the top of the page, musica mundana is represented by a circular universe encompassing the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. In the middle panels, Lady Musica points toward four people who represent the four bodily humors. The bottom panel, Musica Instrumentalis, contains several musical instruments stacked on the floor and hanging on the walls, but the vielle stands out as the only instrument being played. Rather than pointing to the instrumentalist in a gesture of approval like the above panels, Lady Musica raises the index finger of her right hand, admonishing the fiddler. The use of this illumination as the opening page for Book of Sacred Music implies a deeply ingrained institutional prejudice towards musical instruments and their performers. The second Boethius quote is a tripartite hierarchy of musicianship and further elucidates what is implied in the previous image. The lowest class of musician includes instrumentalists who, quote, are excluded from the knowledge of the science of music and made servants, as said, devoid of all reason and destitute of all speculative thinking, end quote. The second class of musician is the poet, who at least writes words to melodies, but only from a natural inclination rather than from reason. The true musician is the philosopher who applies the capacity of reason in order to judge the merits of musical performance. Furthermore, among the orators, there was also periodic prohibition of musical instruments in church and preaching against professional performers. Christopher Page has studied some of the sermons written in Paris in the late 12th and early 13th century, which show clergy beginning to differentiate between performers so as not to condemn them all indiscriminately. Thomas Chobham, for example, characterizes different types of performers and their spiritual acceptability in a sermon from 1215. The first two categories of performers are damnable, acrobats and contortionists whose performative gestures embody shamelessness, and those who perform gossip and lies at court. The third category includes singing instrumentalists, who may be acceptable to the church depending on the content of their songs and where they perform. Quote, "There is a third kind of minstrel using musical instruments to entertain people, but there are two varieties of these. Some go to public drinking places and wanton gatherings so that they may sing wanton songs. They are to move people to lustfulness, and they are damnable just like the rest. There are other, however, who are called jaclatores, who sing the deeds of the princes and the lives of the saint and give people comfort either when they are ill or when they are troubled." End quote. For Thomas, the acceptable songs are morally uplifting histories and epics. These serve an important social function of treating sickness and relieving the stress of everyday life. The instruments mentioned in the sermon as the most appropriate for accompanying these songs are the viol and the cithara. By the end of the 13th century, clergy like Johannes de Garceo felt the need to educate students on secular music and the playing of instruments, particularly the viol. In the following quote, Johannes praises the viol above all other instruments. Quote, "The viol evidently prevails over all musical instruments known to us, for as the square includes the triangle and the greater number includes the lesser, so the scope of the viol includes all other instruments within itself." End quote. With the shift in attitude towards instrumentalists, several questions arise. What happened in musical culture to inspire the shift? Who participated in the change? And what makes the fiddle so special to have gained the most renown? The variety of bowed instruments has given rise to several theories concerning the organological development. The earliest image of a bow in Europe comes from 10th century Spain, according to Werner Bachmann. While many other scholars, such as Thomas Brinkley, Timothy McGee, and Howard Mayer Brown, have studied the viol, relying on iconographic evidence, I'm hesitant about some of the conclusions these scholars make with only the reduced number of images that get published along with their books and articles. There's a need for a central repository of collected images, like the Bowed Strings Iconography Project, which is online but not searchable yet. The scope of my own musical and iconographic analysis here is reduced to the images pertaining to these three fiddlers. Of the three, Perdigon has the greatest reputation for playing the fiddle, demonstrated in his Veda, and the historiated initial accompanying his songs. His Veda reads, quote, "Perdigon was a jongleur, and he knew well how to fiddle and to invent and to sing. And he was from the bishopric of Galvedon, from a town called L'Esperon, and he was the son of a fisherman. And on account of his composing and by his wit, he rose in prestige and such great honor that the Dalfi Delverna retained him as a knight and gave him lands and rents and clothed and armed him for a long time." End quote. While the Vedas do not necessarily provide historically verifiable information, they do tell us important information about reputation. And in the context of cultural love, reputation takes precedence over reality. For instance, the troubadour Geoffrey Rudel famously fell in love with the Countess of Tripoli based on the descriptions of her beauty and worth alone. The fact that Perdigon's skill as a fiddler is mentioned in this list of his talents, even before invention and singing, highlights the fiddle as the most important feature of his social status. Most Vedas open by identifying the troubadour's place of birth and rank, but for Perdigon, that information is relegated to the second sentence. Furthermore, the way troubadours are depicted in their portraits also emphasize the main aspect of their social role. Clothing, gestures, and props all contribute to their reputations. Perdigon is the only musician troubadour to have a specific instrument mentioned in his Veda, as well as it appearing in his portrait. Next, I want to present a musical analysis of one of Perdigon's songs as if it were performed with the fiddle. This is a speculative approach, since the only evidence we have for the use of the fiddle in troubadour songs come from the Vedas and from a few song lyrics which refer to the VL. We must also keep in mind that pitch was relative to each different performance context. Nevertheless, I believe this kind of analysis is useful because it suggests ways in which the fiddle may have influenced troubadour song, and in return may have been shaped by vocal techniques of the period. Often in traditional world musics, the vocal and fiddle ornaments mimic one another. And the close sonic relationship between the timbres of the voice and the fiddle may be one reason why the bowed instrument became so popular. Two features I want to focus on in this musical analysis are tuning and ornamentation. Musicologists often write of Jerome of Moravia's tuning from the Tractus de Musica, and the fact that they all work for extant melodies, especially the second tuning, which Jerome specifically says has a wide enough range to accommodate all secular songs. When I tried this tuning with Perdigon songs, however, I ran into problems with range and dissonance. The pitch range of Perdigon's melodies spans from middle C as the lowest pitch up to F5. And when the musical phrases begin or end on these pitches, an open drone of D or G will create a dissonance. Because of this dissonance and the fact that the image of Perdigon's instrument shows only 4 strings, my analysis will use an alternative tuning found in the 14th century Berkeley Theory manuscript. This treatise gives tunings for the 4 instruments, starting with the fiddle, by placing the letter name on top of the letter name of the note on top of the string. The fiddle here is tuned C, D, G, C. Perdigon's song, Los Mals d'Amor, shows that the range of the melody is comfortable in this tuning. There are plentiful choices for open string chords and drones accompanying the melody. Some options are shown in red on the sheet music. A few phrases that cadence on C could be played with a drone, and several ornaments fit well within idiomatic fiddle fingerings. The ornaments from phrase 4, for example, can be played with all 4 fingers on the second string, which avoids a string crossing in the other tuning. A similar thing happens in the last phrase, where the motive is repeated sequentially on the lower set strings. Lastly, the concluding figure ornaments the pitch F in a manner that is not found in other troubadour songs, but works well on the fiddle. Next, we will look at the Veda of Elias Kyrell, which presents a similar career trajectory as Perdigon. Elias left a stable career as a craftsman to become a minstrel knight. There is some surviving historical evidence of his travels. He went on the 4th Crusade and worked at the court of Thessalonica before traveling to Spain and staying at the court of Alfonso IX of Leon. His reputation as a musician, however, is not as flattering as Perdigon's. Elias Kyrell was from Sarlat, a town in Perigord, and was a craftsman of gold and silver and a draftsman of arms. And he became a minstrel and traveled for a long time around the world. He sang badly and invented poetry badly and played the fiddle badly and spoke still more badly, but he wrote words and music very well. Despite his apparent lack of skill as a performer, his inventiveness as a composer seems to be the root of his success. Another version of his Veda attempts to restore a decent reputation to Elias, calling him, quote, well-versed in letters and very clever at inventing poetry and at everything he wanted to say, end quote. He had a disdain for the rulers of his day, and the author of the second Veda gives this as a justification for why his work was not as esteemed as it deserves. Elias's portrait has him dressed simply, with one hand raised in a rhetorical gesture. Unfortunately, none of Elias's melodies survive. The final troubadour who is remembered for playing the vielle is Pons de Capdoi. His Veda follows a more standard form like Elias's, listing place of birth, then status, then skills. Quote, Pons de Capdoy was from the same bishopric as Guillaume de Saint-Lydier. He was a rich man and a very noble baron, and he knew well how to compose and fiddle and sing. He was a good knight at arms, an agreeable speaker and pleasing lover, tall and handsome and well-mannered, end quote. As a baron, Pons de Capdoy sits at the top of the social hierarchy. The author of his Veda describes him as the epitome of knighthood, noble, valiant at arms, and well-mannered. His portrait also emphasizes his status as a knight dressed in armor on horseback. While it is unsurprising for a member of the ruling class of this period to be educated and eloquent, the fact that Pons de Capdoy had a reputation for playing the fiddle is unusual. The only other historical person I have come across in my research is Bertrand II, whose seal depicts him playing the fiddle on one side, and on the other side he is armed and mounted. The courtly love aesthetic from other literary genres, however, provides more examples of bellatorists with admired musical skills. Two examples from the romance genre include Tristan, who's a multi-instrumentalist playing both harp and fiddle, and Fulker the Night Minstrel from the Nibelungenlied. In Gottfried von Strasbourg's Tristan, King Mark declares that he desires the companionship of Tristan because of his courtly skills, combining masculine activities like hunting with courtly musical activities. Quote, "Days we shall ride hunting, nights here at home, we will sustain ourselves with courtly things, harping, fiddling, and singing," end quote. In the Nibelungenlied, Fulker the fiddler is featured in one important scene where he falls in love at first sight with an unattainable young lady and sings her a love song with his fiddle, only to use the same fiddle later in a pivotal battle scene, wielding his bow as effectively as a sword. The embodiment of these values of masculinity and nobility in the fiddle, and especially the bow, suggests that the fiddle played a distinctive role in medieval social artistic networks. The interplay among various actors in the network includes a multi-directional role within a many-layered network. The inner layer involves the troubadour, the beloved, and the song, which functions as a message communicating the troubadour's love. Sometimes the song is handed to a jongleur or minstrel who becomes an intermediary for the troubadour, taking on the first-person perspective of the poet-lover. Or in the case of Perdigon, these roles fuse into one person with the fiddle on hand to aid in the transmission of the poetry. The aggregate formed in this web of relationships is a melding together of Boethius's lowest two categories of musician, the poet-composer and the instrumentalist. With the application of speculative analysis, we can further imagine the impact of the VL on the performance and the creation of these songs. I add the manuscript to the VL song complex as the medium through which one iteration of the song is frozen in time and reaches us today. In some cases, the beloved responds with a token of acknowledgement. Perhaps she favors the troubadour with her love, or even writes him a song in return. Additional layers of this network include the audiences that hear and popularize the song, spreading them more widely than one musician could, and no doubt changing the song according to the occasion and the abilities of individual performers. And lastly, the artistic patron financially supports the troubadour and participates in the performance of the song indirectly as a judge of its merits, fulfilling the role of Boethius's, quote, true musician. Occasionally, the troubadour names specific people in the final stanzas and asks them to perform this role, as in the case of the concluding stanza of Perdigon's Los Mals d'Amour. Quote, "Song, I want you to go to Sir Asimond's and to Sir Tostem's, because you will be pleasing to them, but do not stay among base men, for he who is more worthy, I believe, that he will be better able to understand you," end quote. Asimond's and Tostem's are names for friends of Fulker de Marseille, who was a troubadour himself before becoming the Bishop of Toulouse. Thus, in this one song, we see an overlapping spheres of the three estates, albeit with a certain hierarchy maintained. Nevertheless, the multi-directional participation of the VL seems clear. On one hand, we see professional musicians using fiddle to accompany both lyric and narrative genres. On the other, aristocrats and literate members of society witness these musical poetic performances and are influenced in their own writings and performances. And today, we can try to show our own worth by better understanding these webs of relationships. Thank you.